Thanks, Jan. Our next speaker for the day is Chris Hoag. Chris Hoag has been working on riparian and wetland systems for over 40 years and is the author of over 120 technical papers on applied planting techniques for riparian and wetland ecosystems. He has been working with stream bank soil bioengineering techniques for 37 years and has developed 2 practical field manuals on bioengineering and over 100 papers describing these techniques, how to install them, materials needed, management after installation, and what zones riparian plants go in. Chris was formerly the project lead of the Interagency Riparian Wetland Plant Development Project with USDA and the NRCS Plant Materials Center in Aberdeen, Idaho. Chris retired at the end of 2009 and opened up a small consulting business. He has worked, taught, and consulted all over the US, Canada, Mexico, and made 2 trips to Afghanistan to provide technical assistance to the Afghan Ministry of Forestry and Range. So from here, Chris, I'll let you take it over. Thanks.
We've got you on video, Chris, but I think you're muted still.
How's that?
There we go, perfect. And we can see your desktop there.
Okay. Good morning. I'd like to thank Drew and the Wade Committee for giving me an invitation to speak to you today. It's been a while since I worked in Washington, but I do see some familiar faces out in the audience, and it's good to see you here. It's, of course, good to see everybody else too. Today, I'll be starting off talking about how to develop a planting plan for riparian areas, and then in the second hour, I'll talk a little bit about some advanced information on the principles behind soil bioengineering and how to use bioengineering treatments and techniques and the details on how to make things work. So I guess right now we'll just jump right into the PowerPoint and we'll go full speed ahead. So we'll talk about developing and implementing a planting plan. There's quite a bit of information that needs to be developed. It's similar in a lot of ways to engineering plans, where you need to develop information before you go to the field and then get more information once you're in the field. So to get successful establishment of vegetation in soil bioengineering treatments, it depends on a number of things. And one is understanding your stream, trying to figure out where it is, what it is, how it's working, how it's not working, and what's causing some of the erosion. Next, accurate planning. The more information that you have and that you get, the better off you're going to be in terms of putting together a successful planting plan. Reconnaissance, get out of your office and get out in the field and walk around on the area that you're going to work on, because the more you see it, the better you can, and you'll understand it a lot better than just sitting in your desk. You want to make sure that you select the appropriate species and the species type, and we'll talk more about that. Handling, make sure when you're working in the stream and you're trying to plant things, remember that the plants are alive until you get your grubby hands on them, and then they die. So we're going to talk about how to handle them to keep them alive. Next, establishment techniques. I'll talk to you about a number of different techniques that'll help you get a higher establishment rate on the plants that you plant. Monitoring and maintenance. This is a big one. So many times it gets lost, and monitoring and maintenance is one of those things that can make or break this project and all the projects in the future, because you learn so much more from monitoring and figuring out what kind of maintenance is necessary. You can figure out a better way to do things. So the success of the project is dependent upon the complete integration of all those steps. Planning steps, objectives, establish clear objectives. This is the main thing. I spend a lot of time developing objectives, working with the landowner to make sure I understand what that landowner wants and make sure that the landowner understands what he wants. Inventory, trying to characterize that existing condition out there. And then you want to determine what the potential is. What's the optimum condition? Next is developing design options or alternatives to achieve that potential. Remember that you're not making that decision, the landowner is, so you want to make sure that you give them a number of alternatives that they can pick from. Make sure you monitor to measure how successful your plan was. And then objectives drive all those. So some considerations for developing a good plan. What to inventory? One, soil. Soils are really important, especially texture, any layers or chemical factors, anything that you would classify as a limiting factor. It's good to make sure that you understand what that is. Next is climate. Understand what precipitation, how much water do you get on the site. The hardiness zone, remember that you can find at the USDA site. It'll tell you the extremes on both extremes in terms of temperature and water and various things like that. And it helps you get the right plants. And then water. Water is probably one of the most important things because it will tell you a lot of things about that stream that you need to know in order to plant and where to plant the plants you're going to put in there. Low water level especially is really important, as is, of course, runoff. And if you got a stream gauge nearby, you can get a lot of information right from that gauge. You don't have to go out and get it on your own. Any diversions or dams, culverts, bridges, anything like that, you want to make sure that you note. What else to inventory? Current management. Management is one of those things that you need to talk quite a bit about the landowner and the operator to understand how they're managing the land. This is one of the easiest and cheapest ways to correct things that are going on in the riparian zone. Historical management. Is there something that happened in the past? When I was working in Nevada, in the northern part of Nevada, there was an old rancher named Sparks who ran hundreds of thousands of cattle all over on his land and, of course, on government land, on everybody else's land. And understanding that that occurred in the past will help you understand why the vegetation is in the current state it is. Big game wintering range. It's awfully hard to establish shrubby material or even grasses, etc., in a place where big game winter because they eat everything. So you need to understand if it is there. Stream morphology, make sure you get the right morphology. Flooding history, that's a big one to make sure you understand what kind of floods have occurred in the past, what has happened when those floods occur, where they flood, how high it floods, etc. Plant inventory, you want to make sure you get a good idea of what's out there, woody and herbaceous. Plant condition, is it in good shape? Is it not in good shape? Is it vigorous? Is it just degraded? That kind of thing. So for riparian vegetated communities, when you're doing your inventory, you want to look at the composition of wetland plants, herbaceous plants, and woody plants. And those are pretty important so that you can get an idea of what you may need to add that isn't there, especially when you start talking about woodies, shrubs, and trees. That can be really, really important to get an idea of what's there and what is successful there and what isn't there. Next is condition, density, and diversity. As with anything, you want to make sure that you know how much is there, how diversified the site is, what condition it's in. Beaver and muskrat activity, that's a big one, especially working in riparian zones. Beaver and muskrat, you can always work around them. You may be able to do some limited removal, live beaver trapping or something like that to get everything started and then allow them to come back in again. Climate and temperature, always a big one. The amount and seasonal availability of water. When do you get the water? How much is it? And are you in sort of a semi-arid zone? Are you in on the west side? That, but you still need to know all those things. And then regional extremes of temperature. You want to plan for the mid-range, not the extreme ends, and that's one that you look at the extremes and you're going, oh, I can do this, and yet the mid-range is where it's going to make or break your project. These are very important considerations when designing your project, and they're critical for incorporating vegetation. Elevation. Can you bring vegetation up or down? One thing is high and low vegetation. Can you bring vegetation from high elevations to low elevations? Generally, you have a fairly high success rate. One thing about riparian plants is they're cosmopolitan. They can grow in a lot of different areas. If you match the soils and you match the moisture regime, that'll give you a lot more success overall. One of the things you don't want to do is take vegetation from low elevations to high elevations. Generally, you've got a pretty poor success rate there. Your physiological cycle will be off because it's tuned to the low elevation, and you'll have a little shorter growing season. So in Alaska, they've done that where they actually planted plants and trees, and they were flowering when it was snowing. So as you can tell, that wouldn't be a very good way to get things going. So as you develop your design options, remember that your design options are sort of put together to move the existing condition more towards what the potential is. And I go through sort of a 4-step process in doing this in my mind, and then when I'm out on the stream. First of all, I remove the non-native species. If you can do that, that'll be a big step forward in getting the native species back in there, and they're going to be a lot more successful for the site. The second thing is to restore stable stream geometry, the channel geometry. If you can get that channel geometry tuned to what the stream is, then it's going to be a lot more stable, and you can plant it a lot easier. Number 3 is you want to lower the floodplain if necessary, especially if it's in size channel. Sometimes this is pretty important, especially when it's incised, and you need to get that floodplain down so it actually is effective and works with the stream. And the fourth part is to replant the native vegetation using bioengineering techniques and treatments. And remember, this develop design options here should address what the objectives are. So 3 things that I would look at in terms of prioritizing your treatments. And the first one are management changes. Management changes are the cheapest and easiest way to go and fix a stream, believe it or not. It doesn't take a lot, especially if it's farming practices, grazing practices. It could be timber, anything like that. It could be urban development sort of thing. Management changes are the first things I look at because you can do a lot and very cheaply. Number 2 is looking at bioengineering practices, planting, getting your woody vegetation back in to the system, making sure that you're working with the stream to keep it from eroding more, or reducing the erosion, I should say. And number 3 is structural approaches when necessary. And sometimes, of course, you're going to have to get into some pretty heavy-duty structure, but we have developed a number of planting techniques that go right with those structures. So you can work with the engineers to get plants in those structures. Next thing I want to talk about is zones. Riparian zones are a way for you to understand where you are in the stream, and it gives you a lot more successful vegetation establishment. In each one of these zones, there are different plants that go in those zones based on the amount of stress, the amount of water, and what kind of flood conditions occur, etc. So let's talk a little bit about those. Let me go to this one. This is a rule of thumb that I like to have just in my head. And these are critical flow velocities. If you have a hydrologist or you have an access to a hydrologist, they can get a lot more specific information and help you out with that. If you don't, then these are some pretty good rules of thumb. If you're less than 3 feet per second, in terms of flow. Herbaceous vegetation will do a good job in holding the stream together. Once you get between 3 and 5, you're going to need some woodies in there and the herbaceous. 5 to 6, you're going to plant primarily woody, but don't forget the wetland plants because of their huge root systems. They're important anytime. If it's greater than 6 feet per second, you're probably going to look at vegetation and structures. And when it gets above 8 feet per second, you're probably looking at some heavy duty structural treatments with some addition of vegetation. So let's talk a little bit about species selection. First is when you're looking at species, remember when you're looking at something like this along the stream, you'll notice the dark things hanging up in there, and that's debris. And what happened is the flood came down and it literally laid down those plants, and then the water went over the top and some of this debris was deposited on top of it, and then the stems came right back up again, and the debris will hang up for a little while and then it'll fall down. So when you're looking at for flexibility of stems, you want to look at creeping or shrub type species, not tree type. And you want to look at that and pay particular attention to flexibility when you're in high water velocities or high debris loads, when you're bringing down branches and trees and that kind of thing, because you want to have, as they deposit, you want the stems to come back up as much as they can and function right. High ice loads, that's a big one. And for those of you that have ice, when the ice lands on the trees and shrubs, then it's going to lay on there for a while until it floats off or it melts, and then the plants will spring back up again once that happens. Just remember that different species have different growth and flexibility characteristics, and you need to understand those. Grazing problems. If you have grazing problems like down here, you can see this one is grazed pretty heavily, and this side of the fence is looking pretty good. When you're looking at grazing, you want to look at low palatability species, ones that that the cows don't particularly like to eat, and that'll help somewhat. Look for strong suckering species, so that if they get in there and they start eating a lot of the vegetation along the stream, that they'll start regrowing as soon as the cows are removed. And you want to look at rhizomatous species, which means they got growth of the roots will spread out quite a bit rather than seed producers, because if they're grazed again, you can get the rhizomes to produce more grass. Next, severe ice flows, again, rhizomatous and deep rooting species will help you recover from heavy ice flows. Here's one that I get a lot about is why should you plant? And I get people that always ask me this. And so the first thing I'd tell you is nature abhors a vacuum. And if you don't do something, nature will. And typically weeds and annuals will be the first ones to come in. And there's not a lot of ways that you're going to prevent that. But if you can add in some perennial species, that'll help a lot. So vegetation will come in anyway, yeah, but vegetation comes in by order of succession. Usually it's annuals, and then it's perennials, and then shrubs, and then trees, depending on what site you're at. It takes many, many years to get or approach a climax vegetation community. So if you can jumpstart that successional process, then you can get to that climax community a lot easier. Weeds come in first, so just realize that they're going to come in. Make sure that you have a weed control program set up in your monitoring and maintenance procedures so that you're ready when the weeds do come in. And woody species, just remember, they take a long time to come in and reach an age where they provide function for the stream. So in some cases, we've actually, and especially salmon streams, is we've gone to using very large bald and burlap plants, because as soon as you plant them, you actually have function and shade that help the fish. Number 3 is planting can accelerate the vegetation community and recovery. It just tends to accelerate everything and get the plants that you really want in there started. Rather than wait for succession, you can plant some of the species you want in that community. One proviso for that is you don't want to plant climax species. Climax species usually take the successional species to provide the right place for it to grow. So generally, either you're going to let climax species come in on their own, or you will plant those in a phase 2 planting that's down the road after the successional species have become established. And last, don't forget, is aesthetics, number 1, and number 2 is regulatory compliance. The Corps is starting to require that you plant, and making sure that you have a good planting plan will help you be in compliance. So why this big thing about riparian vegetation? And it's important for a number of things. A couple things are, it stabilizes the stream banks, because it has pretty good root systems. It shades the water, provides good fish habitat, and lowers the temperature of the water, etc. It improves water quality. Remember that the microbial populations in the root systems will break down organic materials, and it just improves the water quality overall, rather than you'd have to pull out all the water of the stream, run it through a water treatment plant, and then put it back in again. The plants can do a lot of that. It provides good fish and wildlife habitat, obviously, and it builds the stream banks by catching sediment. So now let's talk a little bit about how to get plants to grow, riparian plants. And the ones I'm going to talk about are we call them dormant, unrooted hardwood cuttings. And we'll talk about each part of that. First of all, a hardwood cutting is defined as taking a branch or stem or trunk from a mature woody species for the purpose of propagation. And with riparian plants, and there's a number of those, and I'll talk about those in a minute here, is that they have root primordia, or root buds up and down the whole stem. And when you plant those in the right spot and you get the right conditions, then when you have soil to stem contact, you'll get root growth. And when you have air to stem contact, you'll get leaves and shoots. So those root primordia are very important, and there's something that willows and etc. have. And so the species willows, cottonwoods, dogwoods, if you're down south in the southwest, baccharis, there are a few other species. I would caution you to remember that birch, alder, and a few others will not sprout from hardwood cuttings. So don't collect those as hardwood. Those would have to be containerized plants. When you're cutting hardwood cuttings, you want to make sure that you cut them while they're dormant. And remember that dormancy is from leaf fall to bud swell. So in the spring, as the buds begin to swell, that's when it starts losing its best rooting potential. And in the fall, when the leaves fall off, remember, anytime, even though the leaves may change color, may have a few falling off, the plant still has to give nutrients and water to the leaves that are still on. So you have to wait until they fall off before you really start collecting them heavy. So with the propagation, when you're planting cuttings, you want to make sure that the bottom 10 to 12 inches are in the lowest water table of the year. And I want to make sure that I stress the lowest water table of the year. That's one of those that if you dig a hole like now, it may not be exactly the lowest water table. So when you hit the water, you may have to go further down than what you anticipate. So if you can do that, then you're going to increase the stability of the cutting. You get a lot better results from like cows chewing on it or elk chewing on it or something like that. It increases the potential of the water reservoir in the pole, which is going to give you better success, better leaf production, etc. Allows for the uptake of water from a lower horizon than what you would get. So you're going to be able to get those cuttings to grow in areas where you might not get them to containerized plants to grow. And this one, you can see this cutting is pretty deep, and you'll notice that he's quite a bit deeper into the water here. And remember that you're not getting it into that 10 to 12 inches into the lowest water table is the #1 cause of establishment failure. On all the projects I've looked at, and when you start finding that you're losing a lot of plants, generally the #1 cause is that you're not deep enough. All right, so let's talk about some planting recommendations for pole cuttings. #1 is soaking the cuttings. It hydrates the cuttings and it starts swelling the root primordia. And remember that the root primordia are below the bark area. And so what you want to do is swell those root primordia until they're just about to come out of the bark, to extrude out of the bark. And if you do that, then it takes a lot less time for the plants to get established. You assist in the establishment under dry conditions because you're reducing the water stress, you're increasing your shoot and root growth, and you're increasing drought tolerance, and you're lowering your mortality. And one of the big things that took me a long time to figure this out, but soaking during the fall will actually give you huge increases in success in the spring. So one of my favorite planting seasons is the fall, not the spring, because you get a chance for the plants to get established, or and it'll start sending out root systems during the winter, and then it's ready to go a lot faster in the spring before the weeds start. So the procedure for planting cutting is you want a fresh cut end. It's just like when you go and get a Christmas tree at a Christmas tree lot, the first thing they do before they put it in your truck is they cut off a couple inches of the bottom of the tree. And what that does is open up the tubules in the bottom and allows the xylem and the phloem to work better, and it allows it to uptake the water. If you can do that, that's one of the big things I like to do. Roots will emerge after about 17 days or a little bit longer. It depends on the species and temperature, but generally you can say that. So what I like to do is I like to soak them for about 10 to 14 days. You don't want to soak them long enough to allow the little white water roots to come out. You want to stop before those come out, because generally if you try and plant those, anytime you put soil back in there, you're going to knock off those little water roots. And when you knock off the water roots, what you've done is you've knocked off a whole bunch of energy from the stem. And so it has to produce more roots in order to get established. So the answer is, don't let it get to the water root stage. There are a couple ways to soak the plants. One is you can soak the entire cutting. This is an example up here. Just remember they're wood and they float. So you got to think quite a bit about how you're going to get them under the water and keep them under the water. If you can't do that, then soaking about half of the cutting is the best thing you can do, and it will suck water all the way up to the stem that isn't in the water. So let's talk a little bit about after harvest. And so when you harvest, you can go ahead and plant right away. In spring or fall, you just go ahead and cut it in one spot and plant it in the next. Remember, what I've found is soaking will tend to increase your establishment success. Stored is good. I do a lot of storage. I tend to store them dry like this. Do not wrap them in wet burlap. Don't put wet newspapers on them. Don't spray them with water. Don't do anything. Just put them in a cooler that's about 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and just store them dry. Of course, the key to this is soaking them before you plant them. But you can store them for about a month and a half. And then after that, your success rate will start dropping. And so, you know, storing is good, but don't get too long. And you want to soak for that 10 to 14 days before you plant the stored species so that you can rehydrate them. Green cuttings. In a lot of cases, sometimes it's regulatory permits, sometimes it's construction schedule, a lot of different things. And what I mean is when you're trying to, when the project is starting to go, you may be locked out until the plants have already sprouted, so they aren't dormant anymore. And what we find is that if you go ahead and treat a cutting that has already leafed out as a dormant cutting, that means cutting off all the side branches and about 2 feet on the top. Remember, 2 feet on the top is where the flowering parts of willow are. So we don't want it to flower, so we're going to go ahead and cut off that top 2 feet. And then you're going to cut off all the side branches. The problem is that you're talking about 10 to 20% survival. So it's not very much, and you're going to want to plant a whole heck of a lot more than what you would typically do if they were dormant. So planting methods. As you can see from these different pictures, there are a whole bunch of different methods, and you can do a lot of different things, and it sort of depends on where you're at. There are low-tech methods, kind of like a bar or pounding it in, to high-tech methods, like the water jet and an auger like this or the big stinger. And you know, you want to be able to, whatever technique you pick, you want to be able to reach the lowest water table of the year. And so getting down that far, first of all, you have to know where that is, how deep it is. And second of all, can you get there with the equipment that you picked? And that's going to be a key factor. Accessibility of the equipment. If you're trying to get in there with a backhoe or a bobcat or something like that, you're not going to get in there if you've got rocks as big as Volkswagens. So again, going out to the site, looking at it, and assessing what you need to get in there is going to be important. Washout problems of the planting stock. If there's no protection for the planting stock, a lot of times when you get spring runoff or a flooding condition, then sometimes it'll wash out your stock. So you want to make sure that you can get deep enough to hold them there. What method gives you the best soil to stem contact? That's going to be the key to get your plants to grow, is that soil to stem contact to make sure that you get a good root system. Soil texture, and that texture, you know, goes from very fine soils like clays to coarse textures like sand. And it, as you get into, you know, even gravels and cobbles and stones, then that's going to change the way that you might be able to plant. Also, you want to look at layers. Are there compaction layers? Are there clay layers? Is there a calcic layer? And how far down those are? And you may have to either break those up or drill through them. Let's talk just a little bit about plugs and containers, deep pots, Bareroot, etc. Species that don't root from hardwood cuttings like alder, birch, hawthorn, and some of the others, you're going to be looking at containerized stock. I always want to make sure that I stress the fact that unrooted cuttings are really neat, and they're very easy to plant, and you can do a lot of them in a really fast amount of time without a whole lot of attention to detail. but they are not going to be as successful as pre-rooted plants. That's just the way it is. Once you have the roots out, it's a lot easier to get the plants established. So just sort of keep that in mind. Rooted plants can't be planted as deeply as your cuttings. The only exception are the long and deep pots, and that's what this is. This is a deep pot here, and you can kind of see the length of this. You can get those fairly long. The big thing is that if you're having this growing for you in a nursery, you want to make sure that you tell them to leave the stem alone. Do not cut it. In the nurseries, they always like to go in and trim those off, and you want as much of that top as you can get because it's going to change the way you do things, and I'll get into that a little bit more. So again, when you're planting out, especially containerized plants, you want to make sure there's little or no competing vegetation. When you plant, you either want to chemically treat it like with Roundup or scalp 36 inches around the hole. And this will give the plant, your containerized plant, a good chance of at least getting established before the growth comes back in again. Plant in areas with short periods of inundation or flooding. If you're planting in areas that are going to flood pretty deep, you got to do a little extra to make sure that, number one, it doesn't rip them out of the ground, and number two is they aren't covered by water for long periods of time. Plant where there's adequate moisture, and you need to, from your soil survey, you're going to find out how much groundwater there is. You'll find out what various like percolation rate, etc. is, and from that you may need to say, okay, I'm going to need to irrigate these at least for the first year, sometimes 2 years if you're in a drought situation, but generally you can stop irrigating after that. You'll be able to look at the plants and tell if they still need to be irrigated. Soils test, this is what I was talking about. The soils test is, boy, it's cheap, it's easy to do. Just take it into the cooperative extension agent and they can do one. It will give you what the fertility of the soil is. You may need to add some supplemental fertility, and that's just the way it happens sometimes. You may need to add some supplements because the soil is missing a nutrient or macronutrient. It will also tell you what the water holding capacity is. So this will help you design, if you're going to go with an irrigated system, it'll help you design your irrigation system to make sure you're putting them down enough water to fill the profile. And then next is percolation rate. How fast will the water move through the soil? That'll tell you how often you need to water it. So there's a quick rundown for containerized plants. This is just a little schematic that talks about how to use rooted material. Sometimes you can get a tree pot and you can plant that down into this layer, the capillary fringe. Sometime you can get some deep plant long stem tree pots. And notice that it's clear down here, and because the long stem, you can plant it and you'll still have stems sticking out. That's why you don't want the nursery to cut them off. They've even used these where they actually put a tube along the side and with holes in the bottom here where the roots are, and then you fill this up with water and then cap it, and then it puts the water down where the roots are and it helps the plant to grow. And you can do this in pretty amazing situations. Again, deeper, etc. So just something to think about. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, more specifically about the riparian planting zones I was talking about earlier. When you look at those, this is just a general rule of thumb that I use. Flexible rhizomatous roots in the toe and bank zone. You get up into the floodplain or overbank zone, small to medium shrubs, and then medium shrubs would be more towards the upper end of the overbank zone or floodplain where it starts going into transition. Then you're getting into your large shrubs and trees. So let's talk about the tow zone. The tow zone in this situation is here, and it's what protects the stream. And you'll look at the best tow zone treatments are revetments with willow poles and vertical bundles. An example down here, this is what it looked like before. Then, come on. You'll get some, you want to use the revetment because it slows your velocity down and allows sedimentation to occur. And then you're going to plant your willows because the revetment will eventually rot out. It's dead material. So we want to get live material in there. What I wanted to show here is this is a lot more detail than you're going to be able to take in right now. But with these various treatments, there is an initial velocity and then there's an established velocity. And so it's something that for you to remember is that initially there's not going to be a lot of velocity that they can handle. But once it gets established, then you're going to see a lot more velocity that it can handle. So same thing with each one of these. There's a lot of information on this available now in the literature. So this one example, then here's when we did our initial treatment. You can see revetments here, you can see vertical bundles, and then this is what it looked like in 2 years. So it's a good way to do it, and it gives you protection from the revetment to protect these vertical bundles and cuttings that you put in the bank. So another one is for the tow zone is the native sod mats. Generally, these are sod mats that are harvested from donor sites or sites that will be destroyed in the end. You can go in and harvest a bunch of those and truck them to the site. These are not to be confused with the coir mats. There's a few of these that are being sold now where you use coir fabric and they grow wetland plants right in them, and then you just take the mats and plant them. There are positives and negatives to those. I tend to like to use the native sod mats. It works really well. And then you have a massive root system that's there that it'll help protect the bank, and it works with the woodies to build up the strength and structure of the soil. So here we put in some cuttings, and then here's the sod mat here. And then this is when it's done. You can see the sod mat along here. And then it'll start growing in patches, and then this will all fill in with the cuttings are right behind it. And then this is what it looks like in about a year and a half. And then this is what it looks like after that. The bank zone, and I'll talk more about the specifics of each one of these zones and why we call them that, et cetera, in the next talk. The bank zone is this zone. It's right above the tow zone. And some of the best treatments I've found are vertical bundles that you put the base down in the tow zone, but the top is up in the bank zone. They're usually bundles of willows tied together and installed vertically up the bank. It ensures at least part of the willow in the tow zone is in water at all times. You're not going to use these alone very often. Generally, what we find is that the water will come and it'll hit it, and then it tends to bounce over the top of it, and then it'll start eroding back underneath it. And I found that in several. So I like to use a revetment or barb to help protect those. The other thing that I'd like to point out is with vertical bundles is that when you look at pictures, a lot of times you'll see these guys that have vertical bundles that are this big around. And now think about how many cuttings are in a bundle that's that big around. I mean, there's probably 100 cuttings in there. Then think about, you put all these effort into harvesting them, and then you're going to tie them together, and there's this great big bundle. How many cuttings in that bundle are going to grow? The whole center part is not going to get soil to stem contact, so the center part will very rarely grow. It'll only be the outside layer that gets in some of that sediment to give us that soil to stem contact. So my recommendation is 3 to 5 cuttings. That's usually just about the right size. And if it's a little bit bigger diameter, 3 is fine. If it's a little smaller, then I tend to go with 5. You'll get a higher establishment rate by using fewer cuttings in that. But here's one in Nevada near Reno that this bank, as you can see, is just gravel and it's eroding away. This is just weeds and stuff down here. And then we went in and did a treatment where we put in vertical bundles and we put in cuttings and we put in revetment. And then this is what it looked like. And so it's amazing how fast it'll grow. And then you still have the revetment here. Over time, it may get covered in sediment, but if you get a big storm that comes in and starts washing away, you still have the woody protection there. Another bank zone treatment that I like are live cuttings or poles. I tend to not use the term anyway, so what you want to do is with these cuttings, you want to plant down to the lowest water table of the year, like I talked about. You want to leave about a foot above the ground surface, sometimes a little bit more. What you'll find is if you leave a lot above the surface, sometimes it'll die back to the ground, and then it'll start sprouting from the ground. And as long as you are thinking about that and you're aware of that, then that's okay. If it's above there, a lot of times what we find is you'll get pretty good dicky bird habitat or small LBJs. We'll use those. Plus you'll get some intersection of velocities, so you'll slow some velocities down. So you don't want these cuttings to be shaded by competing vegetation, and reed canary grass is one of those that you have to be very careful with. Number one, it has a huge root system. Number two is it grows pretty tall, and you have to have your cuttings sticking out of the top of that. So just be aware of that. You need to have that good soil to stem contact that I talked about over and over and over again to get the root systems to grow. And you want to muddy them in to get rid of the air pockets. So here's one. This is in northern Nevada. You can see it's been incised quite a bit down, and you can see from the trails all through here is the cows really like it down in there because it's the only green thing to eat there. And then we went in and planted a whole bunch of cuttings like this, and this is after 1 year, and then this is after 3 years. So it established really well and did what we really wanted it to do. Next thing is the overbank. Most people call it the floodplain. This is where it comes out of the channel. And this is an important one because this is where the most fertile soil is. And as the water comes out during flood situations and it hits the vegetation on there, it allows the sediment to drop out of the water as it flows by. And that's where you get your topsoil, and it's the most fertile areas. One of the treatments I like here is willow clumps. And this is actually going out and digging up live clumps. And I like that because they already have the roots on them. You don't have to wait for the roots to grow. And it also has above ground biomass. So you can plant these clumps so that the root mass is at the lowest water table. I'll talk a little bit more about this, some specifics on that. And the stem parts, you can bury part of the stems too, and those stems that are buried will root. And there's those of you that are familiar with root collars on like apple orchards or something like that, you don't have to worry about that with riparian zones because it doesn't really have a root collar, and you can plant it fairly deep, and that's why it'll grow. One thing I'd point out to you is that with clumps, it's kind of a sleep, creep, and leap. Basically, when you plant it, it will sort of grow some leaves out, but it'll look pretty raggedy. And that's because it's sort of sleeping and recovering from the trauma of being uprooted and a lot of its roots cut off. Then the second year it's going to creep, and which means it's going to put out more root systems. And then the third year it'll be amazing. It'll just leap out of the ground, and there'll be leaves going everywhere, and you'll think, "Holy mackerel, where's this thing been?" So if it's not doing what you really want it to do, just give it a little bit of time. So here, where they're planting the live clumps, and then this is what it looked like in 1 year, and then this is what it looked like at the end of 3 years. Another treatment that I like to use on the overbank or floodplain is containerized plants. And this increases the diversity of your species, so it's not all willows, not all dogwood, that kind of thing. It allows for the establishment of lawn hardwood rooting species like alder and birch. It also increases the establishment of your, of course, hard to grow species that grow generally slower. And deep pot plantings allows you to put it in areas where water is hard to find. So, you know, when you're looking at it, you're going to want to look at a little bit bigger potted material. And then what we do is we use a small mini X and dig a hole, and we drop the root system way down in there. And then in here, what we had to do is we had to put some cages on it because the beaver were working this stream pretty heavily. And this is what it looked like on the third year. Transition zone, this is basically going from water to dry. And this is the zone where you're going to typically have more trees. Here is your floodplain right over here. And then this is the transition zone. Here are some different things that you can look at. This is a trench, and then there are clump plantings, there are potted plants, willows under riprap, all that kind of stuff. In the transition zone, the containerized plants, typically you're going to plant trees in this zone. This is where the first place where you can really plant trees, or at least on the upper end of the overbank zones where you can start. Again, you're looking to increase your species diversity. You're looking to get shade on the water. You're looking to get larger and deeper root systems for protection of the bank. You may need a little extra water with containerized plants, so you may have to put in an irrigation system. But that irrigation system usually is, you don't need it more than a year. In a drought or dry area situation, you may have to go 1.5 years to 2 years. But then I generally will wrap up my irrigation system and move it to a new site. Soil fertility is pretty critical when you're talking containerized. So these are containers. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with those. And then these are book trainers. It's like a book, it opens up and then you've got the growth in there, and then deep pots. The upland zone, that should be what everybody's familiar with. That's where you get out of the water, where the water provides additional, help for the plants. And the upland plants, you're going to plant grasses, shrubs, and trees in this zone, but generally they're going to be drought tolerant, and that's something that's important. You might consider filter strips in the edge, kind of right above the riparian zone, to catch overland flow of sediment and nutrients coming off of farm fields or grazed areas, that kind of thing. Filter strips can do a lot. And you also are looking to plant your upland species here. There is a lot of information at the NRCS technical guide for suitable planting techniques for the upland. So basically questions now. There are a lot of things I covered today, or at least on this side of the show. So I'm hoping that we'll talk some more on the next hour.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for that. And just a reminder, folks, you can put your questions in the questions box, or you can also raise your hand and I can unmute you and you could ask your question directly. We do have a couple of questions for you here, Chris. The first one is, how would you recommend getting a pole cutting below a clay layer?
I guess the easiest thing that I would say is that, of course, it depends on how deep the clay layer, how thick it is, and there's no easy answer to that one, I'll tell you, because I've tried it many, many, many times. And what I'm hoping is that you have a clay layer with a good soil above it. And sometimes you'll have a clay layer with good soil below it, and then you just have to drill through it. But when you start talking the clay layers, there are some real advanced techniques that you can try that include even putting good soil in with it. Sometimes we've threaded the plants in through bags of potting soil and then dug bigger holes in the clay soil and put the bags with the cuttings in it into that. So again, that's a lot more advanced technique.
Okay, great. Another question here, how are the vertical willow bundles planted?
Well, real fast is that you go on the vertical bank. Generally, I like to use a 3-to-1 slope. That's the best. And then you're going to dig a trench that's about the width of your vertical bundle. And then you're going to dig a small hole right in the bed. And you're going to put the bottom of the vertical bundle into that hole. You're going to lay it against the bank in the trench that you dug. And then you're going to put 2 dead stout stakes, and I'll talk more about that in the next hour, in there to hold it down. And then you're going to move soil in, and then you're going to wash the soil in. The big thing is, how long are your cuttings? You want to make sure, if you can, you want to make sure that they go about a foot above the top of the bank. If you can't get them that tall, there's some advanced techniques that you can go to that'll give you a little bit of help with that. But that's the way you do it, and usually plant them. I like to plant them about 3 to 4 feet apart, and then put live cuttings right into the bank in between them.
Great, thank you. Just one other comment in here, that so many great ideas. So thank you for that, Chris.
Thank you.